Thank you, Riley. I want to thank Riley Potter and Max Hyman. Our next topic of debate is gender violence, violence against women and sexual minorities, and the right of protection. And just keep in mind, we are going to have a question section at the end, so if you guys have any questions, just keep them in mind, or if you want to quietly jot down, that'll be fine. Women and sexual minorities face discrimination, inequality, and stigma across the world. From the campesinos in southern Venezuela, to the steppes of Mongolia, to the urban jungle of New York City, or to the scattered settlements of southern Egypt, women and sexual minorities do not nearly enjoy the rights that are afforded to them under the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Women own less than 1% of the world's land. Their conditions are, in general, and by far worse than men, and individuals are executed on the basis of their orientation via institutionalized discrimination. Under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone is guaranteed a certain protection, such as the right to security of person. In almost all cases of gender violence, human rights are violated. Gender violence includes sex trafficking, systematic physical abuse, and verbal abuse. When it comes to solving the issues regarding this topic, an obvious dilemma of how to properly address gender violence becomes highly controversial. Our next two panelists, Hassan Rasmi and Nazia Kabria. Hassan, if you want to take a stand. Hassan Rasmi is an undergraduate student at both Orange Coast College and Irvine Valley College in Orange County, California. A political science major, Hassan has remained actively committed to his involvement both on and off campus in domestic and international political arena, and hopes to transfer this fall to pursue an international relations degree. Hassan was one of 10 other students chosen from the United States to attend the U.S. Department of State-funded Benjamin Franklin Transatlantic Fellows Institute at Wake Forest University. Has officially lobbied Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, is a recipient of multiple social justice scholarships, attended the recent Global Zero Nuclear Non-Proliferation Summit at Yale University, and was in Sacramento this weekend to protest state budget cuts to public education vis-a-vis a political labor internship program at Orange Coast College. Hassan will be traveling to New York City and San Francisco in April as part of IVC's MUN delegation to the conferences being held there. Hassan? And Nazia Kabria Nazia Kabria is a 19-year-old and is majoring in international relations. This is her 5th semester at IVC, and she has been a member of the MUN team since last spring. She was part of the award-winning delegation in MUN FW last spring, and is one of 6 people chosen to represent Council in NMUN New York this April. Nazia hopes to attend law school and pursue a career in international human rights law. Thank you. If you want to please welcome Hassan Rasmi.
Thank you and good evening. Throughout our final topic, we will be discussing gender violence, which includes violence against women and sexual minorities and their right of protection. Now, I will preface by citing a portion of the preamble of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which states that whereas recognition of inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Additionally, the peoples of the United Nations have in their charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Now, I shall begin with women. As previously mentioned in this forum, women do not have an equitable standing in this world. According to various UN gender reports, women perform 66% of the world's work, produce 50% of the world's food, and earn a generous 10% of the world's income. And even more astoundingly, women own less than 1% of the world's land. This inequity is part of the vicious cycle that illustrates and perpetuates gender violence. Today, there exists an unacceptable presence of this violence against women. It may take the forms of sexual harassment, sexual slavery, physical sexual abuse, and other physical forms of violence, even including murder. Countries need to integrate the roughly 50% of their population, women, in an equitable way. So far, many regions of the world have failed to do so. Now, I'd like to bring up a few statistics, that just illustrate how women do not get their fair share, and contrary to the Declaration, do not receive the same rights as men do. 1 in 3 women have been beaten or coerced into sex or abused in some way, often by someone that she knows, and that is an international statistic. Gender-based violence perpetuates male power and control, and according to the UN Population Fund, links to institutionalized gender-based violence. Gender violence encompasses violence against women, girls, and sexual minorities, and is of immense importance. Now, gender violence can exist in a variety of presences, and I'd just like to bring up a few of these facets. Sex-selective abortion and infanticide. It's a silent and appalling reality that many possibly of you here are not aware of, and most commonly exist in India, China, and Egypt. According to a Christoph and Wu Dun estimate, a girl aged 1 through 5 dies every 4 minutes in India alone because of gender-based discrimination. In many, if not most countries, females are not considered as desirable and consequently do not receive the same rights as previously mentioned. Now, there has been some progression that's been made. Although women are hugely underrepresented in government, 20 countries currently have female heads of state, and surprisingly, Rwanda currently holds the most represented parliament represents women the most, essentially. There are other solutions, such as the third facet of the Millennium Development Goals that aim to promote gender equality and empowerment, which includes the education of girls and women, the goal to overcome barriers for schooling of girls, the promotion of women in government, economic rights for all, and acknowledgement of women's work. Now, to my second topic, sexual minorities. Many of you know sexual minorities, such as gays and lesbians, don't fully receive the same rights that heterosexuals do in this country, and that is a heated domestic debate in and itself. But around the world, these people are not just, politically discriminated against. In countries such as Iran and Uganda, being a sexual minority, at least in public, deems you you do not receive the full rights that heterosexuals do. And I'd just like to once again quote the UN Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Unfortunately, that is not the case in both the cases of women and sexual minorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Hassan. Wow, there are a lot of people here. Just a really quick question to you guys. How many of you guys are uncomfortable with gender issues, like homosexuality or whatever it is in the workplace? Anybody? Of course, none of you guys are going to admit it. But the fact is that even 20 years back, more than half of the workplace population would say that they felt uncomfortable talking about these issues, or having someone that was homosexual in the workplace. Now, while this is a startling statistic, I think that we can see that these situations have gone a lot better, which leads me to the main point of my argument, and that is that, well, yes, it is tragic that certain people face gender violence or whatever it is in the workplace. These situations will naturally get better as we increase education and awareness. This does not mean that the international community needs to step forward and, in a way, impose their cultural beliefs of maybe one section of a society, in this case, Western ideals, onto the rest of the world. The way we look at gender violence, it's a very broad issue, and it can include, like Gabriel said, it can include issues like violent slurs or sexual slurs that make people feel uncomfortable in the workplace. So when you look at things like this, it really is dependent on the society itself to determine how they're going to define or react to sexual or gender violence. And it's really important for us to consider that when we're addressing these issues. It's not the international community's job to enforce a cultural consensus on how to deal with certain issues. It is the international community's duty to encourage discussion and education. Another important point that I can kind of bring up about this is that a lot of times we see countries that maybe aren't willing to support resolutions in the United Nations about gender violence, or even about sexual minorities. But we can see in certain specific instances, for example, in the case of South Africa, which has actually legalized gay marriage, but is opposed to certain actions and resolutions within the United Nations regarding gay and sexual orientation related issues. And what we can see from this is that it's really important to consider individual global regions and individual countries rather than looking at the community as a whole. Because what happens is that when you look at specific areas around the world, they kind of start to reach their own conclusions about how they want to shape their society on their own. And what happens is if you ignore that, if the international community ignores that, and they choose instead to enforce the ideas of one specific community, it doesn't work well in those other societies. We can see that, for example, in cases where certain countries, sovereign nations, have invaded other sovereign nations and try to enforce ideals of perhaps democracy or whatever it is onto these countries that weren't ready for it. And what happened is that these people felt alienated, they felt invaded, and more often than not did not comply to these